HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Wealth of Refugees, How Displaced People Can Build Economies, by Alexander Betts, read by Jennifer M. Dixon. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to figures and tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. 1. Introduction. Human displacement is one of the defining issues of the 21st century. Amid oppression, violence, and economic collapse, more people than ever are now forced to flee their homes. Most are quite literally running for their lives, abandoning villages and towns bombed, burned to the ground, or targeted by men with guns. For the first time in history, more than 80 million people are displaced, greater than 1% of humanity. Most displaced people remain within their own country, but more than 25 million are refugees, compelled to leave their country in order to survive. From Syria to Venezuela, the main cause is governments that either attack their own people or fail to prevent other terrible things happening. Such governments are unwilling or unable to ensure the most basic conditions for a dignified life, a life that you or I would think worth living. Leaving behind familiar communities and cultures, refugees face an uncertain and sometimes unwelcoming response in the countries they reach, and the scale of the challenge will soon worsen as climate change makes vast areas of the planet uninhabitable and exacerbate crisis and conflict. Of course, the ideal solution would be to address the underlying causes. Ending wars, overthrowing authoritarian governments, and cutting greenhouse gas emissions would reduce displacement numbers. But the world has struggled to find solutions to these root causes, and the international community has proved deficient at replacing bad governments. Consequently, we are mostly left to address the human consequences of global insecurity, finding ways to temporarily accommodate or permanently integrate displaced people in other communities, and enabling them to live in dignity and with purpose. This, too, is challenging because many receiving societies are reluctant to accept large numbers of refugees, and populist politicians in rich and poor countries often exploit public concerns for electoral gain. Rather than highlighting the contribution that refugees can make to receiving societies, or the moral obligation to host, politicians from the United States to Tanzania emphasize the threat to the economy, security, or identity. In this context, the question is, how can the world find ways to sustainably host growing numbers of refugees and displaced people? This question matters for the rich world. In Europe, North America, and Australasia, upholding refugee rights is critical to maintaining liberal democratic values. To be regarded as liberal and legitimate, rich countries cannot simply turn their backs on people who flee for their lives. One important way to assist refugees is to allow them to enter the country, either by letting them arrive spontaneously as asylum seekers or through organized resettlement programs. Asylum and resettlement in the rich world have an indispensable role to play, but they are only ever likely to be for the minority of displaced people. The overwhelming majority of displaced people do not travel to rich countries. Although some refugees embark on long and dangerous journeys, most cross the nearest border to nearby camps and cities. The biggest challenge for refugee policy is how to create meaningful and dignified lives within these mainly poor countries that are close to war zones and tyranny. This is a book about what works and what can work. It aims to be practical, relevant, and solutions-oriented. Importantly, it is evidence-based. In a policy field, refugees and migration, in which narrative, claim, and counterclaim are often made without recourse to fact, This book uses a range of social science methods to explore the kinds of policies and practices that can actually provide sustainable sanctuary to refugees and other displaced populations. It does so mainly by learning from the experience of 3 countries in East Africa, which, despite hosting more refugees than the whole of the European Union, EU, and more than 5 times as many as North America, have each adopted innovative and in some ways progressive refugee policies aimed at mutually benefiting refugees and host country citizens. The goal is not to romanticize these countries' experiences. They have been far from perfect, nor is it to suggest they can simply be replicated elsewhere. Context matters. Rather, the aim is to critically assess what has been effective and under what conditions. The search for sustainability. My starting point is 3 observations about trends in forced displacement and refugee movements, which are likely to endure, relating to geography, numbers, and politics. First, contrary to popular belief, most refugees are not in Europe or North America. Some 85% of the world's refugees are in low- and middle-income countries. This is because such countries often neighbour crisis countries, and because they often have porous borders, meaning that the first country to which people flee is usually a neighbouring state. Most refugees do not have the means, aspiration, or freedom to travel further. They remain in camps or cities in the region they come from, and this may offer some advantages, sometimes a common language, a similar economy, and the ability to easily retain contact with the homeland. For example, Somalis fleeing to the so-called Somali region of southern Ethiopia are able to speak Somali with the host community, engage in similar income-generating activities as back home, and sometimes go back and forth to south-central Somalia to maintain farms or property. However, both refugees in such countries and the low- and middle-income countries that host them frequently face significant challenges. Refugees are usually required to reside in camps with restrictions on the right to work and their mobility. Their access to basic services, such as education and healthcare, may be inadequate, and, even close to home, they may face discrimination. It is unsurprising that a small but probably growing number choose to move onwards in search of a better life. For the countries that host them, the inequitable distribution of refugees around the world means that it is the countries with the fewest resources that bear the greatest responsibility. Although refugees often make an economic contribution to the areas that host them, and most host countries respect the right of refugees to remain on their territory, large numbers may also be perceived as a source of insecurity, economic competition, or environmental degradation. For decades, Tanzania, for example, has repeatedly argued that despite hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees, it has lacked adequate support from the international community, sometimes scaling back on refugee rights in protest. Second, numbers of forcibly displaced people and refugees are increasing, virtually year on year. The number of both displaced persons, including those displaced within their own country and across borders, and refugees, who represent a large proportion of that group, is higher than at any time since the Second World War. Most flee from chronically fragile or failed states, with over half of the world's recognized refugees from just Syria, South Sudan, and Afghanistan. But practically each year, the list of fragile and hence refugee-producing countries seems to expand. Venezuela and Yemen are among the countries that have recently gone from relative stability to societal collapse, and it will be many years before people can go home. Several factors underlie the trend in fragile states, but among them is the widening distribution of power in the international system, which is exacerbating big power rivalries between the United States, Russia, and China. These rivalries play out within small states of geostrategic importance and yet simultaneously paralyze the UN Security Council in its search for solutions. All the credible projections on the distribution of global power suggest that this trend is unlikely to abate unless China and the United States build a shared vision for responding to fragile states. And a further trend is likely to further exacerbate displacement: climate change. Anthropogenic climate change is an incontrovertible fact, and it will affect many areas of social life, which in turn have implications for migration and displacement. In extreme cases, such as natural disasters, desertification, and sinking islands, the effects on displacement will be direct. In other cases, the effect will be to amplify and exacerbate other sources of displacement, such as food insecurity and conflict. Where states are weak, climate change will have its greatest impact on displacement. Already we are seeing the effects on forced displacement. In the northern triangle of Central America, the surge in forced movement of people from rural communities in Honduras and Nicaragua to the U.S. has been partly attributed to the effects of climate change on food security and its interaction with weak governance. Across the Sahel, resource competition attributable to climate change is exacerbating existing conflicts in ways that have led to displacement in Niger and the Central African Republic. Although there is nothing inevitable about future forced displacement scenarios, current trends strongly suggest that numbers will grow, possibly significantly. Third, the politics relating to refugees and migration is increasingly divisive. In Europe, North America, and Australasia, migration has steadily risen in its political salience to become one of the most important electoral issues. In some countries and regions, it has become the most important political issue for voters. The so-called European refugee crisis of 2015 to 2016 was opportunistically mobilized by populist politicians in a way that polarized societies and ushered in electoral success for the far right. In the absence of the crisis and the way in which it was politically represented, it is arguable that Brexit in the UK, as well as the rise of Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, would not have taken place. In the US, the politics of immigration has shaped growing societal division and escalating xenophobia. Across the Western world, immigration has become a scapegoat issue, serving as a proxy for other unrelated social problems, such as the disappearance of labor-intensive manufacturing jobs and precarious financial markets. Regardless of how disingenuous much of the political narrative has been, the political consensus in the rich world is for strict limits on mass migration. The politics is not much more auspicious in many parts of the global south. Xenophobia and the politics of immigration are not simply rich world phenomena. Some governments observed Europe's response to the refugee crisis and have mimicked the same restrictive policies towards refugees. In 2016, observing how Europe paid off Turkey to curtail the movement of Syrians across the Aegean Sea, Kenya threatened to immediately close the Dadaab refugee camps and expel all Somali refugees as a thinly veiled means to induce greater international support. Only slightly less cynically, Concern about refugee numbers has been a key part of election campaigns at both national and municipal levels, from Colombia to Lebanon. Anti-immigration rhetoric has become a global vote winner, and asylum for the displaced is caught up in the maelstrom. There is, however, one significant difference between the positions of high-income countries on the one hand and low- and middle-income countries on the other when it comes to refugees. Relatively rich countries are at least in a position to engage in responsibility sharing with relatively poor countries that host refugees in ways that may be mutually beneficial for the states, if not always for refugees themselves. And as we will discuss in Chapter 14, the global economic recession created by the COVID-19 pandemic will exacerbate each of these trends, increasing levels of displacement and creating the conditions in which xenophobia thrives. Given these three starting observations about current and future trends, there is a need to identify approaches that can be sustainable. So, what does sustainability mean in the refugee context? I argue that it has three key elements. First, for refugees, a sustainable response must deliver their basic needs and legal entitlements. In the language of refugee governance, it needs to deliver protection, assistance, and solutions. Protection implies access to all rights under refugee and human rights law, most notably the right not to be forcibly returned to a country in which there is a serious risk of harm. Assistance means access to basic services to ensure a guaranteed minimum standard of living. Solutions relate to ensuring long-term integration within a society, whether through return to the country of origin or integration and naturalization in a new country. Second, sustainability requires a model that can maintain political support at local, national, and international levels. In order to endure over time and to avoid backlash, refugee policies need to be able to retain the backing of politicians, and to remain in power, those politicians need to be able to retain the support of their electorates and constituencies. Political authorities in hosting regions, whether at municipal or provincial level, need to be able to credibly argue that the local host community benefits from the presence of refugees. National host governments need to be able to credibly argue that hosting refugees brings benefits that are in the national interest. And the wider world of donor governments needs to derive benefits that justify the allocation of scarce national resources towards supporting host countries in other parts of the world. Third, a sustainable refugee model must be able to function at scale and endure over time. Given rising numbers, the growing number of chronically fragile and failed states in the world, and the spectre of climate change, the world needs to envisage models that can not only work for 25 million refugees today, but potentially also for significantly larger populations, perhaps even of 50 or 100 million people crossing borders because they cannot access the minimum conditions for living in safety and dignity. To deliver at scale, approaches will need to be as efficient as possible in terms of economic, social, and political costs. Reconciling these competing criteria is one of the key global policy challenges of the 21st century. The goal of this book is to begin the search for models that can resolve the challenge of providing sustainable sanctuary. The book is written from the tradition of political realism. My aim is for my research to be politically relevant. Of course, not all research on refugees and forced migration needs to be politically relevant, and critical perspectives that distance themselves from politics have an important role to play, not least in challenging power structures and questioning the way we think about the world. My aim, though, is to engage policymakers and practitioners. That does not mean that I am uncritical of dominant power structures, but that I am chiefly concerned with providing insights that are applicable to the contemporary world. Achieving relevance relies upon working from within a framework of political constraint and being explicit about the assumptions that define those constraints. From an ideal theory perspective, one might hope that it is values that ultimately shape political decisions regarding refugees. But my previous research and policy experience in the refugee field tells me that this is not always the case, and so I work from a non-ideal theory perspective within which I regard national-level politicians to be mainly concerned with preserving power and intergovernmental politics, to be mainly shaped by the pursuit of interests and power. Of course, values and norms can and do play a role, but their influence is mediated through political competition. When they are compatible with the interests of the powerful, they flourish. When they are not, they wither. This means that when I think about the refugee system, I am trying to find a model of sustainability that reconciles the moral obligation to ensure refugees access to protection, assistance, and solutions with the constraints of world politics. In that sense, my approach might be broadly characterized as migration realism. Refugees and development. There is a growing consensus among policymakers that the best way to achieve sustainability is to help refugees to help themselves. If refugees can be empowered to meet their basic needs independently of aid and also contribute to the economy of the host society, this has the potential to benefit everyone. For refugees, it can support socio-economic inclusion and improve access to entitlements and opportunities. For host communities, it can allow them to share in the benefits of new job creation and the improvement of public services. For donor governments, it may provide a way to provide cost-effective refugee assistance at scale. This idea is encapsulated in the concept of refugee self-reliance, the notion that rather than having long-term dependence on humanitarian aid, refugees can instead be supported to gradually support themselves through external investment in the long-term economic development of the regions that host them. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, defines self-reliance as the social and economic ability of an individual, a household, or a community to meet essential needs, including protection, food, water, shelter, personal safety, health, and education, in a sustainable manner and with dignity. Self-reliance is often seen as closely related to the idea of moving from relief to development, or bridging the humanitarian development gap. The long-standing default model of closed refugee camps, providing refugees with indefinite access to humanitarian aid, conventionally in-kind food assistance and basic shelter, but denying their access to employment, freedom of movement, and adequate education, is now widely understood as outdated and unsustainable. It has been characterized as refugee warehousing, a denial of rights, and a waste of humanity, and that characterization is apt. Although humanitarian aid may be crucial during an emergency phase or to address vulnerabilities, it becomes problematic if it endures indefinitely, sometimes for decades, and justifies the denial of rights and the curtailment of nurturing refugees' skills, talents, and aspirations. So-called protracted refugee situations, such as the nearly 30-year-old Dadaab camps in northeastern Kenya, exemplify the misery of refugees being effectively warehoused for decades without the prospect of going home or being properly socio-economically integrated in the host society. Indeed, socio-economic rights make up most of the entire second half of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, and yet they have been systematically undermined for decades by dominant humanitarian practices. Instead, development assistance that supports job creation, infrastructural expansion, and improvement in public services for both refugees and the host community is now widely regarded as a more sustainable pathway, offering refugees greater autonomy, dignity, and purpose, and enabling their presence to benefit surrounding communities in what are often remote and underdeveloped border regions. Politically, refugee self-reliance is often framed as win-win. The logic is that it can offer a basis for interest convergence between northern donor states and southern host states. Northern donors have an interest in reducing the need for onward migration by refugees and in creating more cost-effective models of refugee assistance. Southern host states have an interest in attracting additional development resources that can not only benefit refugees, but also support programs and projects that benefit their citizens. That interest convergence is, in turn, what unlocks greater opportunities for refugees. This basic vision for sustainability is not new. In different forms, self-reliance has been around since the interwar years of the 1920s, when Greece, faced with large numbers of refugees arriving from former Ottoman Empire states, including what is now Syria, allocated plots of land to the new arrivals and collaborated with the International Labour Organization, ILO, on the creation of agricultural work schemes that could benefit both refugees and communities in remote rural areas. In much of East Africa throughout the 1960s and 1970s, development programs in border areas with spontaneously created rural settlements were the standard response in newly independent countries such as Uganda and Tanzania. During the 1980s and 1990s, the United Nations formalized the concept of refugee aid and development, seeking to encourage donors to contribute additional development assistance to share the burden borne by refugee-hosting countries. UNHCR organized 3 major regional conferences built around the concept: the International Conferences in Refugees in Africa, ICARA 1 and 2, of 1981 and 1984, and the International Conference on Refugees in Central America, CIRE-FCA, of 1989. From the start of the millennium, there was a revival of interest in targeted development assistance as a means to achieve self-reliance, as European donor countries, in particular, became increasingly interested in managing growing levels of asylum seekers moving from regions of origin to Europe. A string of global initiatives were launched with the same goals: to overcome the relief to development gap and support refugee self-reliance through development assistance. From 2003 to 2005, the vehicle was UNHCR's Convention Plus initiative. From 2013 to 2015, it was the Multi-Stakeholder Solutions Alliance. Some of the ideas and language have evolved. Today, there is a much greater role for business and the private sector. Investment does not just have to come from donor states, but whether because of corporate social responsibility or, ideally, core business concerns, private investors have been recognized as a means to enhance development opportunities in refugee-hosting regions. Self-reliance has had previous incarnations such as self-sufficiency, self-supporting, and even free livers. The key development actors have also changed, from ILO in the early years to the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, during the 1980s and 1990s, to the World Bank today. But the basic concepts have shown significant continuity, and the same exemplars of the model, notably Uganda, have regularly been deployed by international organizations and donors to.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?